Well, hello all, and welcome to the Inverted Orthodoxy podcast. I am Doug, and this is Kyle, and Blake is not here. I almost said this is Blake
I was like,
because I was thinking about Blake not here today. This is Kyle.
That is
and
still my name.
Blake is not here today.
No.
We are missing him, and
Will be for next week too, then, I think.
not sure yet.
Yeah.
Not sure. You ever watched the TV show Pardon the Interruption?
Yes.
You have?
I have.
You're not big into sports, so
I'm not, but I just have come on it, mostly because you've mentioned it up front. I should check that out.
when one of them isn't there,
Yeah.
one of the two main hosts, they always have some crazy reason. And so I was thinking about this morning, trying to figure out some crazy reason that we could not do that, but I decided to be gracious.
Wow.
Blake's just not with us today.
No.
So it's just the two of us.
Yep.
And we promise to behave,
Yeah.
even though we don't have our referee.
Though our referee was saying last week he feels like he's listened a couple times while he hasn't been here, and we have gotten along a lot better. We don't need to toss out heretics or anything like that. Like we get along pretty well.
Maybe we're like an old married couple. We just kind of, the first year of marriage can be...
Quite tumultuous.
I like to think of if you take two rocks and you just constantly rub them against each other,
Yeah.
there would be sparks, but eventually they would fit together.
Right.
That's the first year of marriage. Maybe that's just like the first 6 years of podcasting.
So I feel like we have good debates, but just, I don't know. Maybe you're just coming to my side and you're finally learning to be right.
Or maybe you just don't say as many crazy things.
That's true. But with crazy things, no, that's not a good transition.
That was a bad
Terrible
segue.
transition. We did have our Christmas Eve service not that long ago, if you're watching in real time. And one of the things, because this relationship between both Inverted Orthodoxy and Living Springs, the two do interconnect at different times. So we are pastors of Living Springs on this podcast, but also at our church, at our Christmas Eve gathering, we did mention our podcast and invited people to jump in on it. So we did get 3 questions. One of them I know for sure is from a regular attender of our church. But the other 2...
Because that person put their name on it.
Because he signed it.
Yes.
And actually, before he figured out how to send it in here, he texted me directly to make sure I got the question. So I know for sure that his question went in there. But I thought it'd be worthwhile, if you are new to the podcast, new to our church, checking us out, using these questions kind of as a probe to see where are these guys at? Where's this church? What's this church about? We should have done this last week. That's on me. I decided to bump these questions to the top, which just in case you thought you might get used to that is not the way we do things.
That is definitely
here.
not the way you do things.
Well, if you have, then we bump these to the top so you can get your questions answered right away and be able to interact with them there. But normally, the way we do it, just put things in our backlog, unless they are either 1, really timely, something in the world's happening, and so we want to discuss it right away.
Yep.
Or 2, it's something we called AER, accusations, explanations, and recantations, where we take your feedback week by week and respond to it from a recent episode or something else we've said. But for this week, we wanted to bump those up to the top and jump into those questions to honor those coming in. If you're curious about us, our church, our podcast, all the above. And so I'm going to jump with the easy one from the one that we know who it came from Ian here. Is there a reason why Doug is trying to look like he's from the 50s?
I don't think the 50s. That's not what I'm going for. If you'd have said the 90s, I'd have been like, okay. No, there's no reason. I took a sabbatical this past spring, and the last day of sabbatical, the last day before I coming back in the office, I said to Lorelei, I'm going to get a haircut today. And then she came home. She went out and did some stuff. She came home. She said, you didn't get a haircut. And I said, no. I decided I'm just letting my hair grow for a while.
Yeah.
And she was like, okay. Just not a mullet.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, that's a good deal.
Yep.
And I had the same haircut for at least 20 years.
Yep.
And it was just time for something different.
Fair.
And I don't know. So I was thinking about that even the last number of weeks, looking at people going, that person's had the same haircut for as long as I've known them.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that, but I just reached this point where it's like, I need a different haircut.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what the end goal is.
Yep.
This morning I actually was like, I think maybe I want to get it cut. That was the first time I had the thought.
Trimmed or like cut?
I was actually thinking about getting it cut this morning before I saw this question.
Yeah.
So can't even blame Ian.
There you go.
It just was like, maybe it's just time. This has been fun.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I have no idea.
I reached that point with my beard a while ago. I had a beard for 6 years.
Yeah.
And then my wife and I were sitting there one night. And she goes, I wonder what you'd look like without a beard anymore. Let's find out. She said, you wouldn't. I ran to the bathroom, grabbed my trimmer that had sat in my drawer for 6 years, still had battery somehow, fired it on and trimmed it right off. And I haven't looked back since. So
Yeah.
you just kind of hit that moment.
It is actually, when I say the 90s, intentional about that because it is the back would need to get a little bit longer,
Yeah.
and then it would be exactly the same haircut as when Lorelei and I got married.
That's awesome.
So it is very close right now.
You should take a picture of yourself now and like put the two side by side and post that on your Instagram or something like that. Yeah.
So yeah,
Retaining
good
your
times.
youth.
All right, well, let's move on from that to a question I'll throw your way. We'll go back
Sure.
and forth, bounce like we did.
Okay.
What do you think of the quote-unquote love the sinner, hate the sin attitude that many Christians have towards LGBTQ plus people?
Yeah, this is a big one. I just am averse to trying to use the word hate with people in mind ever. Like, I get the sentiment of this thing, and I would often try to, I hope I would be able to apply that to my own life. There are certain things that I just get so frustrated that as God has been working in me, I get really frustrated. And I might even be able to use the word hate. Like, I hate that I struggle with that. I am really averse to trying to follow Jesus, who calls us to love even our enemies, and then even loosely applying the word hate in my interactions with anybody else about their life or anything like that. Especially given that Paul is pretty clear that we are to not use any standards against those outside the church. There's a difference there between somebody who's outside the church and not claiming to follow Jesus and those inside of it, because they've then welcomed that kind of critique. But I just don't think we can justify statements like that in our attitude while also listening to Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Take care of the log in your own eye before you deal with the speck in somebody else's. Like those kind of things. I get it, so I'm not gonna poo-poo on anybody trying to honor. Yeah, I want to see people grow in holiness. If that's your attitude, I get it. But just that word hate throws me off. And then the justification of how I've seen that used in many different forms towards people, especially LGBTQ people, I'm just really hesitant to jump on that phrase. Though I get what people are trying to do, and I've seen people live it out well and compassionately and all that. But I would not encourage it.
Have you seen people live it out well, compassionately? I would say if somebody's living compassionately with people they disagree with in their lifestyle, and I'm not just going to talk about LGBTQ plus people.
Yep.
You wouldn't use that phrase.
That's true. I feel like that phrase just justifies a lot of...
I don't like that phrase either.
Yeah.
I grew up in a church where we were told that all the time. You got to love the sinner but hate the sin.
Yeah.
And that was often an excuse to just say and do whatever I wanted.
Yep.
And then when somebody got offended, it was like, "What? I love you. I just hate the sin."
Yeah.
Yeah. We have to be careful. The number one thing that we need to focus on is ourselves, our own soul, where our own heart is going. Above all else, guard your heart.
Yep.
That's Proverbs 4.
Yep.
And so above everything else,
Yep.
guard your own heart. I saw a quote on Instagram a while back and took a screenshot of it. It was, Christianity is meant to be learning how to control yourself and help others. When it's about helping yourself and controlling others, it's no longer Christianity.
It's good.
When I hear the phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin, like you, I'm like, why do we have any concern at all for how someone is living their life if they're not a follower of Jesus?
Yep.
It boggles my mind that Christians have become so preoccupied
Yes.
with laws and government and who's in charge. Like legislating morality is going to change anyone's heart. Never has and never will. And I think back to when I was in Bible college, and one of the professors in class one day asked this question, and it's never left me. He said, which would you rather have, a Christian nation or a nation of Christians? Because they're not the same thing. And I see in the church today, the wider church in North America, this desire among a lot of Christians for the resurrection of a Christian nation.
Oh, yes.
And what strikes me in that is that a lot of that seems to be birthed out of a desire to make myself comfortable more than a desire to help someone else. First John, I want to say 3, I could be wrong, talks about those who have that hope, the hope of Christ, the hope of resurrection, the hope of eternal life in Christ. Those who have that hope purify themselves just as they are pure. If someone doesn't have that hope, why are we asking them to purify themselves? It makes no sense at all to me. And if somebody wants to come into the church, then let's gently help them out. And that's not on everyone to do, because Galatians says, if anyone's caught in a sin, those of you who are spiritual should restore them gently. And I love the word gently there, because it speaks to how we're supposed to do it, which I think undermines this whole idea of hate the sin, because we can use that as justification to take someone through some sort of spiritual boot camp that we've decided is good for their soul. But we who are spiritual are supposed to restore them gently, while at the same time being very careful not to get our own selves contaminated with that sin. So that's not to say holiness isn't important. Absolutely. 1 Peter, without holiness, no one will see God. I won't even get off on my tangent or what I've been thinking about that verse lately, but that's beside the point. But this whole attitude is like another phrase you hear at Christians all the time is they will just say what they want, and then they'll be like, I'm just speaking the truth in love. Well, there was a lot of truth in that, but there wasn't a lot of love. Like, come on. Like, we use these things without thinking, and they become justification to do what I want. That prevents other people, that controls other people and keeps them from holding us accountable, and keeps ourselves from holding ourselves accountable. And so I like the fact that this person who asked the question said, what do you think of the love the sin or hate the sin attitude? Because I do feel like it's an attitude.
Very much so.
The number one thing we need to do is just love people. Jesus came and hung out with tax collectors and prostitutes. Like, tax collectors would have been social status, where we would think of drug dealers. Like, they were the bottom of the barrel.
And religious extremists.
Yes. But I'm trying to put that in, because we're like, okay, so Jesus came and hung out with the CRA. No, like, he's not talking about CRA employees. Because the second one is prostitutes. Jesus came and hung out. Let's put this in a 21st century context. It'd be closer to drug dealers and prostitutes. I don't think Jesus just went in and was like, I got to hate all your sin, because they wouldn't have wanted to be with him. Somehow Jesus was able to extend love to them while not compromising himself. And that's something that we need the wisdom and the Spirit of God to be able to do. And that I think too many Christians, instead of learning how to live in step with the Spirit and be willing to put themselves in uncomfortable situations while for the sake of others and for the love of others, they instead just stay a safe distance away from people and yell across a chasm in the name of love. And that is not what love looks like.
No. I heard Preston Sprinkle at one point, and I really appreciated it. Talk about how you don't get to define whether you are being loving towards somebody else. And I'm sure there's caveats to it and nuance. But I think if somebody else is going, I don't really feel your love, you can't say, well, I'm loving you. I'm loving you. Like, just not how it works.
And there's a balance to that, because there's times when you would discipline your kids and your kids would say, I don't feel loved right now.
Exactly. That's why, like, there's got to be some nuance to it.
There is a lot of truth to that statement that, yes, we want to judge ourselves. That's really good. I like that. So I just, the whole thing about it, it's the kindness of God that brings us to repentance. And I feel like there's something about the character of Christ and the love of Christ that we have lost in how he dealt with everyone. And then we think, because we're not dealing with LGBTQ plus issues, and I'll use issues in quote, that somehow we're able to judge that other person. Right? Because there's something we've decided is wrong in their life. We can speak to that, and we can hate that sin. What about the fact that there's all sorts of things in my life that are not okay.
Yep. Jesus has a lot more to say about money than he does about sexuality in his own teaching.
So does the whole Bible.
Yep, totally. And yet we're totally okay living on consumerist Christianity.
Yes.
the way we often live.
Yes, absolutely. The greed and capitalism
Yep.
that drives everything in our lives. We don't question that ever.
Yep.
But if we decide something needs addressing,
Yep.
then
It's normally at a very arm's length, so we can talk about it really easily without it affecting us.
it's
and
never an us
throw
issue.
a lot of stones. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. As for the whole conversation around affirming where we make space for in our church, I don't remember the podcast episode number. I'll see if I can find it from Keelan. I think she's got the list. We talked about our accommodating stance and link that in the show description for this episode after we're live, just on the conversation of where does our church land, though we even different spots in different times in our life have landed in different theological camps ourselves. Our church has landed in this place we've called accommodating, making space for people in the LGBTQ community to participate in church life.
Let me also say, when we say our church's stance, that doesn't mean that everybody who comes has to have that stance.
That's what I kind of tried to caveat. Even like you and I may have different theological points to the church, and so where have we agreed we're going to land as a church? Whether individually, that's all where we are.
Yes, but in the midst of that, like there can be like, this is the church's stance, so everyone has to believe it. I don't know that there would be anything at all.
Well, the Apostles' Creed is kind of what we said is the only stance.
Do you think
for our church.
everyone in our church agrees with the Apostles' Creed?
I would hope so.
I would think not, because there's people in our church who are not yet saved.
Sorry. Yes.
They're part of our church community.
That's fair. Fair.
So, but I know that there's people in our church who have not, they're coming to church.
Yep.
They're exploring faith.
Yep.
They're wrestling with things,
That's fair.
trying to figure stuff out.
Yep.
But if you said, do you agree with this statement right now, they would say no.
That's fair. Okay.
So
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Never thought of it that way.
So,
all right, we got one more of these Christmas Eve specials, and then we'll punt into our regular questions, continuing where we were last week. So, Doug, this it pertains to your Christmas Eve message that included a short video that you stole from TikTok.
I didn't steal it. You can take anything from TikTok and you can reuse it. That's right in the terms of use.
I didn't mean
of
in a negative sense. Sorry, I must be slow. But in the Christmas Eve service online, the cartoon played about a pie being baked. I just didn't get the last part. LOL.
So the cartoon is pretty quick. It's only 17 seconds long, and if you don't catch the ending words, you don't catch the whole thing.
Yep.
It's a conversation between Joseph and Mary.
Yep.
And Joseph is leading the conversation. And he says, "Here, I baked you a pie." And she says, "How did you do this?" "I baked it from scratch."
Yeah.
And she says, "We don't have an oven." And Joseph says, "God helped me." And she says, "Joseph," and she starts to like respond to that. And then Joseph in anger goes, "You see how that sounds, Mary?" So, but if you don't catch the Mary and Joseph, you're going to miss the point of it.
Yeah.
That Joseph is
saying it's really difficult to comprehend how you could have a baby without somebody helping.
Right. You're saying that God was the one who did this. And I'm like, you got to give me a little grace if I'm wrestling with this.
Yeah.
So,
totally.
Yes.
There you are. Hopefully that brings some context to it. You can go back and watch on this channel. You can rewind back to there, find that clip.
Or if you Google.
Is that Cyanide and Happiness who made that one?
I have no idea.
That's this drawing style. They used to make these really morbid comics. So it's awesome. I don't know if it's still going.
What did I Google to find it? Because I'd seen it months before.
Okay.
I think I Googled Instagram because I saw it on Instagram, although it was a TikTok.
Mary Joseph Pie comic?
Something like that.
Yeah.
So if you Google it, you can watch it again.
There you go.
So, all right, over to you, Kyle.
All right.
And that's it for the Christmas Eve questions.
That's
and I
it.
feel like to our regular listeners, like, you know, when some company that you are already a customer of has a special.
Yes.
And you're like, oh, I'm going to take advantage of that. And then you find out that
For new
special is
customers
only
only?
for new customers.
Insulting.
And you've been keeping that company in business for all of this time by being a faithful customer.
Yeah.
And it's like, you can't get that thing.
Yep.
That's what we just did to our faithful listeners.
Yeah. That's sorry.
We apologize. We
do
repent right now.
We'll give you your money back, guaranteed.
So, Kyle, over to you. This question that some listener has been waiting and waiting and waiting
There is a
to
long wait for some
hear
of these
the
questions.
answers for.
Yep.
Similar to how there's laws to the physical world, like the laws of physics, are there laws to the spiritual world? what would they be, or what would your hypotheses be?
So I'm stealing this one from Greg Boyd, a book I read near the end of last year, God at War. One of the primary ones, and maybe one of the only ones that I can think of. It's not a law of the spiritual world innately, like the laws of thermodynamics would be of the universe, but because of how God has set it up, so I guess in a similar category, that God has built in free will for all beings of the spiritual and of our realm who also have spirit, where he's given free will, and the implications of that come, the harm, the good, I think is built into the spiritual world. And so that's where we get the fall of angels, as well as sin in our own world, that free will is an uncompromising thing that God has set up to the laws of how the spiritual realm interacts with one another, that he will resolve it all. In the end, that's the promise we lean into. But it seems that even though there is much pain that comes with that God is honoring of that order that he set up. Would be one of the few that I can think of.
I can think of a couple.
Okay.
I can think, number one, the wages of sin is death.
Right.
And I think of that as a spiritual law.
Yep.
Because sin doesn't always bring physical death.
Yep.
Although some people would argue that physical death is the result of the original sin.
Yep.
I tend to look at it and go, God certainly must have been speaking of something else beyond physical death when he said, on the day you eat of it, surely you will die.
Right.
They didn't die that day. God is not a liar.
Right.
He's not referring to physical death.
Right.
And I hear people who say, well, that's just the first example of God's graciousness.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
Right.
There was a death that took place. There was a death in relationship. There was a death in their relationship with God.
Yep.
There was a death in their relationship with each other.
Yep.
That they were no longer naked and unashamed.
Yep.
So there was death that took place in that. And the wages of sin is death.
Yep.
And I think that if we took time to examine our lives, we would see that's always the case.
Right.
We sometimes miss it because death is not instant. We think it will be, if there's going to be a consequence, it's going to happen right now.
Yep.
It's going to be immediate.
Right.
But if you think about wages, you don't typically work and then at the end of every hour be like, give me my $15. Like, you earn wages and then there is a payday.
Yep.
In the same way, I think that sin pays a wage.
Right.
And along with that, similar in vein to that, another one that I could think of as I was pondering this was that whatever you sow, you will reap. But I think that is a wider one than the wages of sin is death.
Yep.
I think wages of sin is death fits into that one.
Right.
But I think in a kind of a quasi way, but whatever you sow, you will reap. God wrote into, as like a spiritual law, into all of creation,
Right.
that is meant to be for good, but that also is has a flip side,
Right.
that it can be used for evil. In order to have that law with the potential blessing,
Yep.
and have people with free will,
Yep.
the flip side of that was that there's the possibility that it could be for negative.
Yep.
So I think that those are the two that come to mind
Right.
off the top of my head.
Right.
That I think there is a law there that whatever you sow, you'll reap.
Yeah.
Like we will reap what we sow. And people in different faiths call it karma.
Right.
People nowadays call it instant karma when something happens. And I think, again, if it's not instant, we don't think about it.
Yep.
But I think if we were to stop and examine our lives, right now we're reaping the things we've sown in the past.
Yep.
And this is a call for wisdom, I think, for all of us.
Yeah.
What am I reaping right now?
Yep.
And do I want to keep reaping it?
Right.
Because if I don't want to keep reaping it, I need to start sowing something different.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of times where people will just continue to sow wheat,
Yep.
use an analogy, and they don't want the harvest of wheat that they get.
Right.
But in the midst of struggling with this harvest of wheat, without thinking, they keep sowing more wheat.
Fair. Oh, I like that. I feel like we're there's a connection between the two things we shared. Like I feel
Yes.
like by free will,
Absolutely.
we will do these things, and the responses that come from it, whether it be in the spiritual realm with angels and the like, or humans, like whatever we do and participate, our free will has consequences, and that's been protected. So
Absolutely.
yeah, I don't know if it's stretching it too much that love's always the best way. Like I don't know that like that's got to be baked in somewhere too to some degree. May not again be immediately the best feeling, but
Is love a feeling?
no, like they may not have a positive feeling. If I act
okay, I see
loving
what you're
towards
saying.
my
Yep.
neighbor, that will be the best way to have lived like the life that Jesus offers us in most fulfilling way. I think of the Beatitudes, those kind of things. Like that will be the way to experience life to its fullest. Though that doesn't mean it's always going to be as happy-go-lucky as we would like it to be,
Correct.
immediately gratifying. So
I would agree with that one.
Yeah.
I actually have said to Laura Lee numerous times lately, the Beatles were right. All you need is love.
Yep.
The problem is humans are terrible at it.
yes,
Like we are, and I put myself at the front of that line.
yep.
I am example number 1 of being terrible at love.
Me too.
If
I was
we-
gonna say agreed, but I won't make that it sound like I'm. Yeah, you are terrible at love.
You can. I'm totally admitting it. If we could figure out how to love right
Yep.
and would be willing to do it at all times,
Yep.
our problems would be solved.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered that
we're
one.
just killing it today.
I know.
Blake gets really long-winded, and
It
that's why
must
we
be
don't
that.
get.
He's so opinionated.
Oh, and he just goes on and on and on.
If you're watching Blake, sorry, we're not
so
sorry.
much for not throwing him under the bus.
We did throw him under the bus in the intro.
There's at least a 50% chance that he's listening right now.
Yes, probably.
And you know what Blake's doing right now? He's like, he's doing that Blake laugh.
I could see his face as you did that. Oh, that's awesome. All right, well, Doug, 2 Corinthians 6 talks about being unequally yoked together with unbelievers. In the past, I've heard it said that it means we shouldn't be overly friendly with unbelievers. I've also heard it said it's only referring to marriage. Can you please clarify this?
Yes. So I see two extremes here. I see can't be overly friendly with believers. And the other extreme is it also only refers to marriage. So I grew up in a church where this was the verse that they always used when I was in youth group when somebody had a girlfriend or a boyfriend who was not a Christian. And it was like, don't be unequally yoked. What is wrong with you? And I'm not saying that's not fitting in that context.
Yep.
But I was an adult, maybe in Bible college, before I remember either somebody, I don't know how I came to this like aha moment, whether I was reading Corinthians or whether I heard someone talking about it going, this verse isn't about marriage and it's not even in a section on marriage. So can we stop talking it about marriage?
Right.
But I think it more applies to the marriage end of things than the overly friendly with unbelievers things. It's talking about partnerships, and marriage is the ultimate partnership. And to be, I think that it's easy for us to look at the New Testament, especially the epistles, as just a bunch of rules. And almost like I've said in the past, a New Testament law, a new version of the law. It's Law 2.0. And not see that all that Paul's writing is trying to teach people, here's the working out of what it means to follow Christ.
Yeah.
And there's wisdom in it. If you're serious about trying to follow Jesus,
Yep.
that's going to mean you are living according to a collection of worldviews and values and perspectives that are going to be counter to the way that the world operates, to people who are not followers of Jesus.
Yes.
So don't be unequally yoked. Like there's just wisdom in that.
Yep.
You can't assume that you're going to be able to be in a partnership with someone with a completely different set of values.
Yep.
And it not end up causing a lot of conflict and a lot of problems.
Yep.
And I'm not saying this doesn't apply to marriage. Please hear me that. But I'm saying it doesn't just apply to marriage.
Yep.
I do think, like I can remember Laura Lee saying once years ago, there was some of the youth in our church, and they were some of the, it was specifically girls in this instance. So I'm not picking on girls. I'm thinking of history. But a few of the girls in the church who were in their late teens, they all kind of were in this age where they started dating.
Yeah.
And a bunch of them weren't dating Christians.
Right.
And I remember Laura Lee saying to me, you know what I'd like to do? I would like to bring them over and sit them down with a couple of the women in our church who are married to unbelievers.
Right.
And just have them talk about life.
Right.
Because Laura Lee was familiar with their story from later down the road.
Yeah.
And going back to what you sow, you will reap.
Yep.
If you're sowing into that relationship and that relationship goes to the point of marriage,
Yep.
you are headed to a path. I'll throw out a book. Andy Stanley, I know you love him. The Principle of the Path.
A lot of this stuff.
The Principle of the Path,
Yep.
which is a great book, but very simple. Look at the path you're on and look at the destination of the path you're on.
Yep.
And if you don't like the destination, get off the path.
Unhitch yourself from it.
Yes, exactly. Get off the path that you're on if you don't like the destination. If you are find yourself, to use a local analogy, driving north on Highway 2 and the last place in the world you want to go is Edmonton.
Get off the highway.
Yeah. If you don't get off the highway, you're going to end up in Edmonton.
Yep.
And you can't complain to anybody. And so I love that book. It was just so practical, but also sometimes we just need to hear the practical.
Yep.
So there is I think it's more than just don't be overly friendly. I think we're called to be the light of the world. And if the light is hidden under a bushel, then what good is the light?
Yep.
But there's a point of partnership where we're headed for trouble.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I'll start one with a definition of yoke. Maybe we should have started there.
Oh, yeah, that would have been good.
It's all good. A yoke, when referring to Jesus' language and
Not
separating, translate, not
egg-related.
egg yolk, yeah. But instead, the device by which two animals would have been attached to one another for a shared purpose in work and endeavor. So you'd have two oxen yoked together in order for them to pull a plow and accomplish a job together. So as always, it recommended, don't ever pull one verse out of context and jump right into it. So I'm actually going to back up and read the majority here of 2 Corinthians 6, where Paul is talking leading into this statement in verse 14. It says, behold, now is the acceptable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. So he's like, come on, like this is the moment to receive all that God's giving us. We are giving no one an occasion for taking offense in anything, in order that our ministry will not have fault found with it, but commending ourselves as servants of God in every way, in much endurance, in affections, in distress, in difficulties, in beatings, in prisons, in disturbances, in troubles, in sleepless nights, in going hungry, in purity, in knowledge, in patience, in kindness, in the Holy Spirit, in love without hypocrisy. So he's talking about this, like, there's this beautiful invitation. There's nothing that's going to stop it. We're going to be offering this.
Live in the fullness of this salvation that is available today.
Yeah, so he's going on there. And the word and truth and power of God with weapons of righteousness for the right hand and left hand, through glory and dishonor, though slander and good repute, regarded as deceivers yet truthful, as unknown yet known completely, as dying and behold we go on living, as disciplined yet not put to death. There's nothing that can stop this. As grieving but always rejoicing, as poor but making many rich, as having nothing and possessing everything. We have spoken freely and openly to you, Corinthians. Our heart is open wide. You are not restricted by us. So saying again, there's this freedom to join in with it, but you are restricted in your affections, so what you love and give your attention to. Now the same way in exchange, I'm speaking to you as children, you open wide your hearts also. Do not become unevenly yoked with unbelievers. For what participation is there between righteousness and lawlessness? Or what fellowship does light have with darkness? And what agreement does Christ have with Beliar? Or what share does a believer have with an unbeliever? And what agreement does the temple of God have with idols? For we are the temple of living God. He goes on to quote there. And so he's painting this picture of like, you have all this at hand. Why would you attach yourself to something that's going to be counter to it? There's nothing that can stop this except for what you give your heart and attention to.
Yep.
He is not calling for us to ignore unbelievers and to not be there. Paul gives us great encouragement to be participants in this world and bringing the kingdom of God.
Right in Corinthians.
Exactly. And loving those outside of the faith. what he is saying is don't get your heart, your attention, and your efforts attached with the same things that the world is doing. So I would look at both the political left and right and pick on our American brothers and sisters for a little bit here again. We've talked about Christian nationalism. That's not unfamiliar in Canada now anymore.
I was going to say, you can pick on some Canadian brothers and sisters with both of these topics.
Totally. And so the far right, I would say, is trying to get that Christian nationalism. Let's put everything up and one of the things there. And then it's easy to pick on the right and feel like that's maybe we spur more of our conversation than the political left, which is all about a defined level of justice and care and compassion. But I've seen a lot of Christians in both camps do so unattached to Christ and then manipulate Scripture to try to then justify their sides on both sides of this whole conversation. Yes. And so the ideas of both justice and conservatism or responsibility and stewardship on the political left and right have to be rooted and flow out of our love for Christ, not then justified back to our Bibles and manipulating it that way. And so I look at what Paul's saying here is like there's all this, join in what Christ is doing. Don't attach yourself to something else. The end at which you're working towards has to be defined first by Christ. And if not, Jesus put it the other way. You can't serve two masters. You can't serve God and money or fill in the blank with whatever thing you're trying to accomplish. And so you can love and be around those people. In fact, you should and must. But do not align your goals, your intentions, your efforts with that, or else you won't be able to attach them to Christ.
Yeah. And I think that, I want to be gentle how I say this, but I think that sometimes Christians might not be unequally yoked with unbelievers in that they're not living in light of that salvation and not intentionally pursuing that. And I'm not saying that's any particular person in mind, but that's just the reality. Like we got to take that context, that verse, like you say, in context of all that comes before it, that Paul is calling us to live into. And then if you're doing that, to me, it's similar to the idea of holiness. We don't understand what holiness is. We think holiness is an external thing, but holiness is an internal thing that manifests itself in a lot of different ways externally. Holiness is to be set apart. And the example that I would use to draw an analogy similar to Paul, because Paul, maybe in Corinthians, I can't think where it is right now, talks about the athlete going into training to maybe it's Galatians to run for the prize, talking about basically Olympic athletes. When we think about Olympic athletes today, and I encourage you to think about any one of the Olympic athletes in the world today that you want to picture. First thing comes to mind is Michael Phelps, because I saw a picture of him the other day with his arms outstretched, holding all of his medals. There's a guy who's holy in his pursuit of swimming excellence. That's holiness. It affects every day of his life. It affects what time he goes to bed, what he eats, all of that stuff. But the holiness is not what time he goes to bed and when he eats. The holiness is I am set apart for one purpose. And that purpose is I want to win gold medals. And I want to win more gold medals than anyone else. And that we admire that. When we see actual holiness in the world, whatever it looks like, we admire it as a thing of beauty. But we don't recognize it as what holiness is. And if we're serious about pursuing holiness, don't be yoked with an unbeliever. Like that'd be like if you were like Michael Phelps' friend and you were like, hey, every time you got together, you're like, hey, Five Guys? Like, I guarantee you wouldn't be friends with him after a while.
Correct.
He would just stop returning your texts and then block your number. Because he's dedicated to holiness and you are unequally yoked with him towards the goal that he wants to go.
And just to put some more context around it, Paul, that I did pull up that verse. It is 1 Corinthians 9:24-27, where Paul's talking about the athletes.
Run to get the prize? Okay.
But also to put context around Paul and his ministry, he refers to himself as the apostle to the Gentiles. Like by definition, who he is spending his time is entirely outside the realm of the Jewish and also then Christian faith. And so he is spending all of his time with people who are outside, by definition, unbelievers to Yahweh alone, let alone Jesus. And so I don't think it'd be the best way to interpret those passages with who the author of that is and what he spent his life doing.
Yeah, and I think he is speaking to the struggle between either withdrawing from the world or compromising. And we're
one more of those Christian things toss out, and this one I would have more agree with, be in the world but not of it, right? Like I think that's kind of the context and the tension there.
I've thought a lot about that one over the last little while.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, I'm not. It depends what you mean.
Right.
Again, it's like, because I see people who are so not of the world that they can't even engage with the world.
That's the other quip that comes around.
So
Don't be
heavenly
so
minded.
heavenly. Yeah. You're of no earthly good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, when I hear people who say, I want to be in the world, but not of it, it's like, it's almost like, what's the word? No. Everything fleshly is bad.
Right.
What is that?
I can't remember. Like
Paul addresses, it's one of the themes that Paul tries to fix.
I'm not
Everything
sure.
everything that's physical is bad, and everything that's spiritual is good.
Right.
Right? And it's all, it can almost lead itself to that. And I can't think of the theological term for it.
Right.
But yeah. So
I think Blake's commenting along here, just
Is he?
FYI, because our Living Springs account is commenting on our YouTube thing. So I think Blake might be logged into his iPad through the Living Springs account. So he both said 3 comments. Good morning, guys. Ha 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 is the second comment. And I was always told unequally yoked would lead to one or the other compromising values and beliefs. But
or conflict, if
or
you want.
conflict, that'd be good.
Yeah.
I heard it put, and I think I've said it even here on the podcast, of the minute church gets in bed with politics, the church is compromised. It doesn't go the other way, I don't think. I don't think politics often compromises for church.
1,000 years of history to back it up.
Exactly. Exactly.
So,
But no, I feel like
hi, Blake.
Hi, Blake, if that is you. If not, maybe it's Keelan. I'm not
If
sure
not, our account is
who
hacked.
logged into the account that's commenting along, so we're just guessing.
So, all right. So it's over to you. Are you done with this question?
I think so, unless you've got anything else.
No, I feel like I'm done with this
Okay,
question.
me too.
So, this question comes with a comic.
From the Naked Pastor. Awesome account to follow on.
Hey.
Oh, I just thought you were jumping. Okay,
I
sorry.
was going to get there.
Okay, sorry.
I was going
to make sure we gave
gonna
credit.
verbally describe
Okay.
the what I'm seeing, but that our audio
Sorry.
only listeners can't. I was going to draw a word picture.
Sorry, I apologize.
It's
All I
ruined.
gave was
It's
the-
ruined. No.
Podcast over.
So from Naked Pastor, he's on Instagram, and if you don't follow him, give him. I encourage to check him out. He's got some really thoughtful stuff. You don't have to agree with everything he says.
Yep.
But I do follow him, and I like a lot of his stuff. So there's a picture of it that he draws. He draws all his own comics of what looks like an old man sitting in a chair, or a grown-up. I'll say a grown-up sitting in a chair, and then a child standing beside the chair, talking to the adult. And the caption at the top says, "How a child shouldn't talk to his father." And then underneath is the child speaking to this grown-up who, by the words written, you would assume is his father.
Yep.
And the child says this: "Dear Father, I'm unworthy to be called your child. Let me be your servant to do your will. Use me as your instrument. Take my mind, take my heart, take my body, take my life. I am nothing, so consume me for your purpose and for your glory, even though I'm the worst person in the world." And then his top comment, or his caption underneath, says, "This doesn't sound like a healthy parent-child relationship, right? I didn't think so either. So why do we act like it is when the context is God?"
When I first saw this one, and before it even came into the podcast, I was like, I think he's spot on with that one. We do have some questions coming up about Calvinism and.
I'm looking forward to that question.
Me too. So
that's gonna be a full. If we get through another question
in that
episode, I'll be surprised.
Totally. And I feel like this lends itself a little bit towards the more Calvinist type thinking. In fact, we've had a number of questions that would lean towards that side of the theological kind of aisle this last while. So we were talking about last week the image of God. More, as far as I understand, I'm not going to try to pretend to be an expert on Calvinism, that the Calvinist idea of bearing God's image, that was to some degree lost in the fall, and so would hold this low view of humanity, where we are complete. Well, first one, just to give away the points of Tulip, total depravity. Like we are completely unable to do any good.
Okay, whoa. perhaps you should just take a second to explain tulip for
tulip
our
is the
listeners who might
5
not be familiar with it.
5 points of Calvinism. I won't give you the other 4 because we've got a question specifically coming up about
Okay,
that.
I just hear like the first point of tulip, and people are like, what is he talking about?
First 5 points of Calvinism, or the 5 points of Calvinism. T for tulip, TULIP, being the first of them, which stands for total depravity. Humans are totally depraved of all good. And so it takes passages in the New Testament that would look at this way, or even of the Old Testament where people are submitting themselves as servants to God. And putting this picture as the image of this child is, I think, exactly taking it to its extreme. I think it's one thing for an adult who's fully aware to say, I am aware and conscious that the way that you are leading me is good, so I want to follow that. Take that, Michael Phelps. Let's go back to that example for a moment. If he's got a coach who he goes, I know this coach is going to help me get to where I want to with the gold medals I want to get to, I fully submit myself to the training plan you're going to offer because I see that it leads to good.
Yep.
That is an entirely different conversation than a child saying, I am totally depraved. Do to me as you will. I empty myself. And it's this manipulative thing there the minute you take out consent and awareness out of the whole thing. And trust, which I won't go on that. And so this idea of hating ourselves and making ourselves so low is a really negative way of handling, I think, a view of Christianity. There is much in the New Testament that can be twisted towards that end. I think of Paul, like all our righteous deeds are like filthy rags, can be easily said like we are just awful, or it can be looked at as think of how much good we think we can do and how much greater the good of God is. And so to compare it, it's like it's filthy rags because the goodness of God is so much higher. And so there's 2 different ways to begin examining all this stuff. So as I look at Paul's life, and we've talked about this one before, both in sermons and on this podcast, Paul begins in his early writing as the least of the apostles, and by the end, he reports himself as the chief of all sinners.
Correct.
I don't think as the major contributor of the New Testament, he's getting more sinful. That's not what I see in his life. But instead, he's becoming so much more aware of the space in his life that he needs to allow God to work in him, not because of a hate for himself, but because of a love of God and who Christ is. So wanting to make space out of an awareness and a consciousness and a willing participant in allowing God to refine him for the expansion of the trust that he already has in him. And so I have come to the point, and I think I've also shared this here a number of times too, I've come to the point of this kind of language wanting to ring true, but not out of a hate for myself, but a trust of like, I want more of Jesus to be in my life. So Jesus, would you take my mind? Would you take my heart? Would you take my body? Because what I've seen, I trust and I love in you. Take my life, not because I'm nothing, but because I want more of what you have and how you've shown me you love me. And so it comes out of this deep relationship, not out of this default, you're better, I'm scum, take me over it. I'm just rambling now. I'll stop there.
So, question.
Yeah.
You started off by saying you think this is spot on.
Yes.
That was your first, but then near the end, you said that there's parts in your life where you've prayed, "Take my mind, take my heart, take my body, take my life," which is literally a quote from the cartoon.
Yes.
So I feel like during the course of your answer,
Yep.
you swung at least partially from extreme agreement with it to occasional acceptance.
No, I fully agree with it in the sense of a child where they are able to be manipulated and robbed of their innocence. And like, so if my kids came to me and said these words, it's not out of a mature, robust, what's the word I'm looking for? Consenting, mature adult perspective. Like, Dad, just tell me how to live and I'll do everything that you want me. That can't come out of where they're at because they're not mature and they don't have that depth of relationship out of who they are yet with me. If they're 25 and they come to me and go, Dad, my life's a wreck and I've watched you for a long time and I've listened, I've sensed that you are, this is probably what all the parents with adult kids are thinking would love to have happened in their life right now.
Yes, we are.
If you could please just, I've learned wrong. I've seen the goodness you've had, and the times that I have listened to you, I've seen that it's been good. As a mature consenting adult, and I see the good that's in your life, would you allow me to have it? It's the difference between a child and a mature depth of relationship for a consenting human. That I would agree.
I just wanted to clarify.
No, I appreciate that.
Because where you came to
Yep.
would probably be right where I'm at.
Right.
That I'm not a fan of this comic if the child has been told that by other voices.
Correct.
Or taught that this is how we approach God, because it misses the heart of God. It misses the love of God.
Yep.
It misses the grace with which, and the compassion with which, and the steadfast love with which God looks at his children.
Yeah.
My problem with the comic is that oftentimes in the church, this is what we've told people.
Yeah.
And they have, then this has become their default.
Yeah.
The default is not the love of God that reaches out to them. The default is, I am a sinner.
Yep.
So we start, and we've said this before, we start in Genesis 3,
Yep.
not in Genesis 1.
Yep.
But the Bible doesn't start in Genesis 3.
Yep.
That's why it's the third chapter.
Yeah.
The Bible starts in Genesis 1. But if we would come to the realization, if we would let ourselves start in Genesis 1 and let our worldview be shaped by Genesis 1,
Yep.
I think we would get to the point where we get to Genesis 3. And that's what you're talking about with Paul.
Yep.
There is a point where we would go, yeah, there's truth to this. I am a sinner.
Yep.
And I am unworthy to be called your child.
Yep.
And I don't say that in a
Self-deprecating way? Or?
no, in a way that says everybody needs to have that revelation right now.
Yep.
I was in my late 20s, early 30s when I had a vision.
Mm.
And I was in this vision, and I was standing in a valley, and I looked down, and I was wearing robes, and the robes were filthy.
Mm.
And I looked up, and Jesus was up in the hills above the valley. Yeah. But as in a vision, oftentimes, he was still close enough that he seemed up close.
Yeah.
And he was standing by a dam.
Okay.
And on the side of the dam was a lever.
Okay.
And every time I looked up at him,
Yeah.
he would pull the lever,
Yeah.
and the water would flow down and start to wash my robes.
Mm.
And every time I looked down at the robes,
Yeah.
he would close the lever,
Right.
the water would stop, and I'd just be standing there with my dirty robes.
Yeah.
And I remember having this vision. It's stuck with me to this day that I can still remember it clearly.
Yeah.
And taking time to ponder it, because I didn't understand it for the first little while, and I had to ponder it and reflect on it. And you need to recognize you're a sinner.
Mm.
Like there's some garbage in your life that I'm trying to work on and clean up.
Yeah.
But standing and staring at your robes is not going to do you any good.
Yep.
You need to look at me.
Yeah.
You need to trust me.
Yep.
And you need to let me work.
That's good.
And I'll take care of it.
Yep.
And so I think we need to teach people Genesis 1 and take them deep enough into Genesis 1. Mm-hmm. And what Genesis 1 is really all about, not the scientific point of creationism, but the point of the image of God, the pointness of the goodness of creation, the pointness of being called very good by God.
Yep.
We need to start there.
Yep.
And if we can get that settled into our heart,
Yep.
that we get it,
Mm-hmm.
then we come to the place where we trust God enough that he can start the process of dealing with the Genesis 3 stuff.
Yeah. I love that. The one of the books that comes to mind is Brian Zahn's Sinners in the Hands of a Loving God.
Yes.
The difference of like the sinners in the hands of an angry God, that old famous sermon.
Have you ever read that?
I read it before I read Brian Zahn's book because it was in the intro. I was like, I got to read that first before I jump into his stuff. Atrocious.
I read it in Bible college because I heard a prof talk about it.
Right.
And so I bought it and I read it and it was like,
Yeah. Like God hates you and you're the worst. And like
God
a
is
spider
holding you over the flames of hell, like you're the spider that you are, despising the very thought of you. And it's only like his gracious compassionate that he has not thrown you into hell because he's so disgusted by you.
Totally. And so, like, what a terrible perspective. You've already mentioned the verse, Romans. It's the kindness of God that leads us to repentance.
Yeah.
I think of the parable of the prodigal son. the one who returns to his father after having gone and tasted and seen of the rest of the world, and knows the love of his father and returns there to the safety of it. Now, Blake, commenting as us, already commented along, says, didn't Jesus say to come to him as children with a childlike faith? Which I agree with, and I think these are two different conversations. Of one, I don't think a child has this self-deprecating language like, I am filth, other than somebody putting that on them. I heard statistically at one point, girls peak self-image at 7 years old, and then it begins to decline from there. That we take on the language around us and filter that into our own image of ourselves later on. So I would say that childlike faith, like my 3-year-old daughter, Blakely, she believes anything I say in the most innocent way possible. And trust me. So last night she had a bad dream. She came to my room and woke me up and had a bad dream. And so I just walked her back, told her everything's okay, gave her a kiss and put her to bed. And she believed the world is just right. Yeah. I think that's a childlike faith, not the 8-year-old beginning to filter the world and trusting the things of the world. So I think that is that childlike faith that I come to again as an adult. And we
come back to that childlike faith through the struggles of wrestling through things.
Yep.
Like, we're quoting Brian Zahn a lot, but in When Everything's on Fire, he talks about coming back to a second naivete.
Yeah. Like that's exactly it, right? We come back to that place of learning it. And trusting God. And so it's a beautiful perspective that comes along with it, but not, I think the self-deprecating language that's in that comic about the child and the lack of consent that a child can have is the concerning part there.
Yes.
Where versus the trust of a child towards a parent is still an affirming thing. And if that parent has told that child to believe things like that, that's, like he says in the description, that's bad parenting. Yes. That's not how God comes to us. But as one who loves and redeems and wants to be with us and has stooped to all ends of the universe to come beside us and love us, not one holding us like a spider over a flame.
And one who calls us to look to him.
Yep.
The problem with that comic and the problem with a lot of that thinking is that it just obsessively shows us, which was the point of that vision that I had.
Totally.
That I had taken the message, and I'm not blaming the people in the church I grew up with. But I had taken the message that I had to keep the focus on me because I was this sinner, that I was this failure, that I was this person who was so dirty and so filthy, that I was always obsessed with myself.
Yep. Yeah.
But if I would just come with that childlike faith and focus on God, he'll clean it up.
Yeah.
Trust him.
Totally. I'm going to let you wrap up while I get behind to end this podcast.
Yes. Well, that is all we have for today because we're just about out of time. Thank you for tuning in and being a part of this. We appreciate you. If you have some responses you would like to give to anything we've said here, please send it in. That would fall into our AER category, and you'd get bumped to the top of the line like the people who Kyle catered to from Christmas Eve. So submit your questions. hello@invertedorthodoxy.com. Go to invertedorthodoxy.com, click any of the Ask a Question links, and you will be able to there ask a question completely anonymously. Have a wonderful week.